Good morning. Okay. Good morning. We are reviewing the end of Ayin Beis in light of everything we've learned, source material in the Maimer Mika Hashem Elokeinu, in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer in Teir and Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and now also throwing into the whole picture the Maimer Veinenu Me'ires Keshemesh Kireach, which is a Mittler Rebbe's Maimer based on Alter Rebbe's Maimer as well. And briefly, where we're at right now is page 1353. I believe we read 1354 actually. Actually, I go even further, 1355, the top of the page. Yeah, we're up to 1355 on top of the page, reviewing that there is in Ohr itself, being that we are looking to understand and appreciate the dynamics of building an interface between these two diametric opposites, the divine creator, all the way to the highest levels, and existence, the creation. So the process is one where we have to take tachtenim, and tachtenim is essentially a state of cheshach, of darkness, and turn it into light, divine light, reveal divine light in it. And being this is a gradual and extensive and comprehensive process, so in general terms, there are different levels of Ohr. And namely, is Ohr Mashpia, what he called Tchar, the Ohr of Tchar, and there's Ohr Mekabel, Ohr Nukva. In the Ohr Mekabel, the Ohr Mashpia, the classic example for that is the sun, physical sun, or any other luminary that's a source of light, not just a source, not just that it's bright, but that it also illuminates. And the sun, of course, is the ultimate, but he also said the light of a candle, light of a flame. And then there's Ohr Mekabel. Ohr Mekabel means that it's not that simple, basically. When I say not simple, I mean it's not just a body that God created that gives off light. The sun is created with those properties. And here are three categories: the moon, light of the moon, moonlight, and the luminous stone, what he calls Ohr Bohir, Evan Bohir, I should say, and three, Ohr Hariyah, which is the main focus here, because if you recall, he began, we're going to understand all this about Torah Ohr, illuminating this world with Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the flame of Havai, Ner Hashem, the flame of God is the soul of a human being, and Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr, he began saying on page 1352 that we'll explain it with the inyan of Ohr Hariyah. But to understand Ohr Hariyah, he's contrasting it with the other forms of Ohr that we just discussed, and he's going to elaborate on this in detail. And essentially, he's now going to we'll sum up on top of 1355, the real differences between these three levels of Ohr Mekabel. So briefly, what we have learned so far is they all Ohr Mekabel, meaning they don't just on their own illuminate. They need something to get that going. The process and the way that happens, that's where there's the difference between them. So to begin with the moon, he said, is called Moir, and on top of page 1353, he made it very clear. He said, being that it's a Moir, it has Ohr, has its own form of Ohr. And when we say lesla megamal klum, that has nothing of its own, it means doesn't have Ohr hameir on its own, meaning an illuminating light. And for that it needs the sun. So the sun does two things, he says there. Number one, it sparks, so to speak, the Ohr in the moon itself, and it also turns the sun itself, is transmitted through this moon, but it's called moonlight. He says, so now, once that happens, the moon illuminates at night as well. And that's why it's called the sun illuminates by day, the moon by night. And that's the process that he says. So it's called Ohr Mekabel because it needs the sun to shine. But it has its own fundamental role, and that's why it's called Moir, as he explained, that it's either the koyach Helem or the chayla shalol lahoyer, and this is all from page 1353. Okay. He says on 1353, which is actually a line from the Maimer of the Mittler Rebbe. I did see that inside. And Adrabah, the more distance itself from the sun, the more it radiates, like we said before, with the Mashpia Mekabel, teacher and student. Even Teiv, the second, Harihumer Gamken B'cheshach. The Even Teiv also has an element, it glows even in the dark. However, it doesn't have its own light at all. All it is really, it has properties that once they retain the light of the sun. I gave examples, technology, you have things that are solar generated. If they have the proper properties, they can retain, as he says. So therefore, but it's it doesn't have any element of light. It's a diamond. Calls it a diamond, like every diamond. And then when he distinguishes between that and the moon, he says that where does it receive its light, from the sun or from the stars, he mentions. But nevertheless, it is never really becomes you can't call it an illuminating light, because it doesn't give off light, it only glows. It doesn't illuminate the darkness. And then comes Riyas Ayin. With Riyas Ayin, there we have seemingly two opposites. On one hand, it's Ohr Mekabel, because the eye will not see in the dark. And it definitely doesn't give off any light, and it doesn't even glow, like the luminous stone. And that's why it needs what he calls a siyua from outside of it that shines. And when it shines, then the eye can see. But when it sees with its own power. In other words, it's not just a conduit for some other form of light. It sees with its own power. And that's why vision is dependent, not just on how bright the day is or how bright the room is, the environment is, but also on the quality of the eyesight, of the physical eye. So therefore, it has two elements. So what is the role of the light, of why is it Mekabel? Because not a Mashpia. Today, the eye does not Mashpia light, and therefore it receives that ability to see only when there's an outside light. But the outside light is not what's doing the seeing. It's only like a light that just removes the concealment, like he said, like I mentioned, let's say something is closed in a box, you open up the box. So essentially, the light removes anything that conceals, so now the eye can see. But then, as he explained, in contrast to the luminous stone and the moon, the eye does not retain any light. That's why if you shut the light, or if you move to another room, that's the example he gave, the eye doesn't continue to see. It always will need that light. Whereas when it comes to the luminous stone, it glows. It glows even when it's even in the night, even when there's no sunlight. With the moon, he also said the same idea, that even after the sun is not shining within it, it also continues to radiate, as he said those words. And that's where we're struggling to understand what that means. But Mashenke b'chinas ariyah shla'acha kabbalah ein meir shim ye'era ner b'cheder echad, like we said, it will not continue to shine. So what's the role of the outside light? Siyua levad. And now he's going to sum up the distinction between these three in more like very concise terms. So this can really serve as a really good summary of what we just discussed, what we're going to review now. And all this is setting the stage to understand what it is in the nimshal, meaning in the moral, how it is lamaila, in the Zohar and Malchus, and then we're going to learn how it is in Torah, Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. So, as I said, all these details are not just technical details; they're all to help us understand how in our so-called ruchnis de kaveda, and ultimately how it manifests in Torah and the mitzvahs and the shama. We can understand the different levels of this process of transforming or illuminating the dark to light, ultimately with the goal of, like we said, and even higher than that. We'll discuss that later when we get there. Okay, now as far as the very sense, I mentioned that The Rebbe Rashab already discussed this earlier. I can give you some sources if you want to look it up. I didn't really finish doing my research on the whole topic, but if you want to look up, you can look. Where is it? I think it's Kuf Ayin Gimel. Let me see him. In volume 1, in Ayin Beis, trying to find where it was. 1 second. He speaks, I mentioned that there are different opinions of how Torah, that's called the Torah version of astronomy, about understanding how the sun and the moon interact with each other. It's a little dense and complex. I mentioned the Rebbe's letter to the Ragachover, asking him to explain and reconcile the differences. But on chapter 113, in volume 1, in the first edition in the earlier edition of Ayin Beis that I've been using, it's page 218, 219. But it's chapter 113. There he brought more about this whole Eir HaShemesh and Eir HaLevana, how they interact with each other. Also, bear in mind that in the beginning of volume 3 in Ayin Beis, he brought the Eitz Chaim, that there's 7 levels of Aliyah, of Malchus, and thus also 7 levels of how the moon and the sun interact with each other. Like I mentioned, according to the Pasuk in the Torah, they were both Me'iris Hagdelin initially, and then the moon was diminished. But in the moon's growth, so to speak, and the moon's development, until the Asad level, when it says Haya Eir HaLevana Ke'eir HaChama, that the moon will be like the sun, there's 7 stages, and then an 8th one that he adds. So this is also very relevant to what we're discussing, but I'll review that later once we talk about the elevation of the moon. Right now, he's establishing what it is today, how it works today. And then we'll talk about how it's transformed in the future. Now, what else did I wanted to add?
What page was that? Kuf Ayin what?
I said chapter Kuf Yud Gimel, chapter 113.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's page chapter 113. It's it's page 218, 219 in my edition. In the new edition, it would be a further page. But the new edition also refers to the previous edition, so you can find it there. Chapter 213. The Maimer Vayeshev Ayin Gimel, Tafresh Ayin Gimel, Chodev V'Shalom. Yeah. Now, I know that we've been discussing how all this works, and some have been suggesting, Meira and Yitzchak wrote to me as well, that perhaps it all means all Beruchnius, that we're talking about actually in the Maimar of the Mitler Rebbe, he uses expression Levana El Yena. Levana El Yena. Now, there's the Levana physical moon down here. There's the Levana El Yena, so-called its spiritual counterpart or archetype. However, when you look at all the commentaries and you look at all the interpretation of Chassidus, Beruchnius for sure it's the case. But it's also clearly from the prophecies of what will be Lasadov, it's also referring to Begashmius. To say that the sun and the moon were only Beruchnius equal in the beginning would basically say that the Pasuk doesn't mean it technically, physically. So there's actually, if you want to research this further, if anybody wants to go into it, I'm not going to go into it so much, it's not so relevant to our learning here, but there's actually Sefer Erchim, Chassidus Chabad, in the Encyclopedia of Chassidus that Rabbi Yael Khan compiled. There's an erech called Eir HaLevana. I believe it's volume 3. We have, I think, 8 volumes of Sefer Erchim, volume 3, Eir HaLevana. There he gathers together all the opinions in Chassidus on the way the moon functions with the sun. As I said, I didn't have the time to go through it in detail so much regarding our discussion here, but definitely talks about it. And literally, there are quite a few opinions of what it means and how you explain it, both the verses and how it works below and how it works above, etc., etc. So that's, if anyone's interested in going further into this, by all means, you can look Eir HaLevana, and the few places in Ayin Beis I just referred to. back in volume 1, as well as the beginning of volume 3 that we've learned. But
Thank you very much.
yeah, regardless, so let me go now on top of 1355, sum up. We'll sum up what he says. So he says, "V'nimtza." I'm on the third line, page 1355. And as I said, as we go, probably things will get clearer and clearer as we understand what it all means. V'nimtza de be'er hariyah yesh girayin l'gabe er levana bebeis dvarim. So he's summing up now. So what do we take away from this? Nimtza. What do we sum up? What do we derive? What do we draw from this? That Er Hariyah has two so-called weaknesses, if you wish. Gedoyin means it's not it's inferiority. I don't want to say the word inferior. I don't think that's the right word. But two things it's lacking when compared to the moon, based on what we just reviewed and learned in the previous classes. And what are they? The base dvarim. Echad she'ena meiras hacheshech. Simple. The eyes do not illuminate the darkness. As much as the eye, of all the power it has, when the eyes, if someone walks into a dark room, or it's the middle of the dark night, the eye is not going to shine. It's not going to be like a flashlight. It won't be like the moon. The moon shines. One way or another, bottom line is the moon is shining, and you can walk to the light of the moon, and you can navigate to it. V'abeis, and the second thing, shetamid tzarich le'er zelaseh. That even when a light is shining, not enough one time. In other words, to turn on the light and then you can shut it, or you can move into another room and the eyes will continue to shine. They won't. For the eyes to see, we're talking now physically seeing. We're not talking about visualizing, dreaming, or envisioning something with the mind. It constantly needs another light. That's the two giroyin. That's the two things that's lacking in comparison to the moon. V'hamayla shaboy, and what's the quality that the Ohr Hariyah has over the moon? Shubchin is gili er be'etzem. It's a gili er be'etzem. When the eye sees, it sees with its own power. It can't physically see something unless a light is shining. It's a gili er be'etzem, like he called it before. Etzem ha'or. It's not a er atzmi and not a er mashpia, because it doesn't illuminate, like we learned, but it's a gilui er be'etzem. V'hariyah, hu b'chinas er atzmi. And it sees the hariyah, when it's the actual seeing is with its own power, with its own light. In other words, it's not like a mirror or a filter or or for that matter, like a telescope, meaning that another light is shining through it. It is a seeing entity. And darkness is not fundamentally concealing its power. In other words, it's not like when you're in the dark, you suddenly lose the power to see. You just technically can't see, which is critical, but your eyes remain seeing entity, like we learned before. This is its maila, actually. Because in other words, so therefore, what's the role of the Ohr, the outside Ohr? Only siyua. It's only like a support. It's only to remove the concealment. So then the eye can do what it has to do. So just for example, if someone was holding down your hand and you couldn't move it, once you move your hand, you don't say the person who removed their hand from you is making you move. Once you remove the thing that was stopping you, then the hand moves on its own. It has its power. That's its power. You want to write something, and for whatever reason your hand is tied up, or some other way, some impediment. You don't say that the impediment is the one who's removing the impediment is causing you to write. Once you release whatever it is that's blocking your ability to do so, your limb or your power to write is able to function on its own. Same thing here with the Ohr Hariyah. So here it goes back, and that's why it constantly needs the siyua. Because without that outside light, like you said, the eye itself doesn't illuminate. But that refers only to seeing something outside of you. Like we said before, you can be on your own in a darkness and dream and envision things because it's the atzme, it's er hameir. So you can envision, you have the power of vision. However, it's not to see something outside of you without that outside light. The nimtze. Okay, so that's one thing we derive from what we learned, the distinction between er hariyah and er halavana. Two things that er halavana has that the er hariyah does not have, and one thing the er hariyah has that the er halavana doesn't have. The nimtze. Now, what's the summation of all of this? She has gimel madregas. Now we're talking about gimel madregas and er Mekabel. Echad er halavana shemekabel es er hashemesh. The light of the moon that receives the light of the sun, and then it shines also with its own light, which on its own cannot shine without the sun, so-called triggering it, but it's its er atzma. But it's still not like this, the eye, because you don't say that the moon has so-called the power of light, illuminating light. It is dependent on the sun, in that sense, whereas the sun is only a siyua for the eye. Va'beis ha'er de even tev, the light of a luminous stone. Shehu ha'er hanikne boy. That's an air that it absorbs, that it retains. Me'er hashemesh, from the light of the sun. Ve'ein ha'cheshech machshechesei, and darkness does not conceal it, meaning therefore it will glow in the dark. Va'gimel, the third is ha'er hariyah. She'ein ha'er hameir loher zelosei. Not like the moon, for example, when the moon shines, it shines. You see, just the moon is shining. Even though to get that going, you need the sun, but the moon, once it's shining, it's shining. And when you're in the presence of moonlight, you see things. Actually, the moonlight will also help the eye to see. Doesn't mention that, but it's a fact. So whereas this, where the eye is not a it's an Eiramer that can shine, in other words, give you clarity through your power to envision the visualization of things. But Sarich Tamid le'er. And this one needs constantly an outside light in order to be able to see things outside of you. Meaning a third entity, so to speak, an entity that's not within your own mind. Akol hu b'chinas er Mekabel. And all these three are all in the category of er Mekabel. Because one way or another, they all need something. They need to receive something to be able to see. They work differently, but they're all in the category of Er Mekabel. But Eir HaShemesh is now another category, Hu B'chinas Er Mashpia. And the sun, the light of the sun, is in the category of a Mashpia, a luminary. Now, obviously, the sun receives that power from God, but that doesn't need to emphasize. Once it receives it, it is the way it functions. Is that it doesn't need any other entity to give it light. It has its own fuel, has its own whatever today we call it the different fission or fusion that takes place within the sun that generates light and heat and so on. Bottom line, it's Er Mashpia. Okay, that's a summation of basically from page 1352 to 1355. Now the next section is going to be a dugma mekolzeh. And explain what is this all an example for? Why do we need to know this? What is this coming to teach us, essentially? And this is slowly building it up. And as I said, this is based on the Maimon Ve'inenu Me'ires from the Mittler Rebbe. And then he's going to lead us back to our the topic at hand, Teire Eir. But as I said, this is quite an extensive discussion that goes. It was 110 pages. Now it's back to it's more like 105 pages more. And what we'll do is, as I've been doing, I'll stop at main junctures just select certain sections to read, and just review the whole summary as we come to develop the Hemshech Ayin Beis all the way back to what we really want to get to. Well, I don't want to say the word really. I mean, it's all important and vital, but the punchline is that interface of difference between the Lamata L'mayla and L'mayla Lamata and Tefillah and Teira, and we will get back to the Maimer of Mika Hashem Elokeinu, about Ner Hashem Nish Mesadam and Ner Mitzvah B'Teira that we've learned. But now, as I said, the Rebbe Rashab said clearly he wants to explain it with Ohr Hariyah, and to understand the Hariyah, we have to understand these different levels of light. But I understand it all in the context of Ayin Beis' interface, that each of these levels helps us understand another dimension of our work of illuminating, as I said, a dark world, ultimately. And each one contributes another aspect to that, but we'll discuss that as we go on. So let me stop here if anybody wants to comment or ask anything, and then we can continue. Yeah. And thank you, Osi Yitzchak. He posted the class that I gave these pages from months ago. I actually listened to it yesterday, and I do touch upon this point, but there I explained it more or less like I explained it here. That's not talking about so much the moon receiving from the sun, but it's more of our experience of the moon. That once the moon absorbs the sunlight, regardless whether it's reflecting the sun at the same time, our experience is directly from the moon. That's more or less how I explained it. But I definitely touched upon, not quite as much as we discussed here this time around. But okay. Good. So before we continue, let me just give a little preface. So at the end of the day, everything in this physical world that was created has, as I mentioned, its spiritual counterpart, or spiritual archetype, if you wish. And it evolves from that. In other words, if you talk about water and fire, for example, that evolves from chesed and gvura. So when we talk about Mashpia Mekabel, when he spoke about Mashpia, Mekabel, where does it originate from? It's going to originate in general in the levels of Zoh and Malchus. So in Atzilus, we know there's the 10 spheres. So Chochmah Bina Das, that's Moichin, that's intellect. But when you get into the Midas, the emotions, so there's Zoh and Malchus, and Zoh is considered Mashpia, and Malchus is like less la megama klum. When we talk about the moon doesn't have anything of its own, is Malchus. So in applying what we just learned to Lamaila, Hadugma calls that Zoh Malchus. That's how he begins the new paragraph on page 1355. The Zoh Hubchinas Mashpia be'etzem uhusei. Zoh is a Mashpia be'etzem uhusei. What is Zoh? Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesod. It's the 6 emotions, and they're all Mashpia. You Mashpia Chesed, you Mashpia Gvura, Teferes. Mashpia means they have their personality, characteristic, if you wish, character type, and their unique properties, and they're Mashpia. That's what they're Mashpia. Malchus be'etzem uhusa b'chinas Mekabel. Malchus, the last of the 7 midas, is be'etzem uhusa is a state of Mekabel. That's why you'll say 6 days of the week correspond to the work week where we go out and produce and create. They're the 6, that's Zoh. And Shabbos is compared to Shabbos Malchus. Shabbos is the queen. Not a day when we're supposed to create and produce, a day when we absorb. Ruchnius, Vayechul HaShamayim. God stops working. We stop working. And it's a day where we channel and we draw down Ruchnius, or the Kedusha of Shabbos. And many others, when you talk about 7, 6, and 1, in this context, Mashpia and Mekabel. So one is Be'etzem Husa Mashpia, one is Be'etzem Husa Mekabel. So right there, you see immediately that Shemesh would correspond to Zoh, and Mashpia would correspond to Zoh Shemesh, and the 3 levels of Ohr Mekabel, starting from the moon, would correspond to Malchus. So basically, you can say that Ohr Mashpia is Zoh, and in Malchus, there's 3 levels of Ohr Mekabel, which is what we're going to learn about now. Okay. So I'll read, as I said, and I may jump around as again, I don't want to read it all if not necessary. I'll only read what I think is most important. She says, "D'cheinu gam lifnei hamiyut." Kishahoyu b'chinas shnei me'eres hagdelim. So now he's going to qualify. If you think about it, however, based on the pasuk, we know like this. It says by Yivra. It says that Ibishter created, created Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim, two great luminaries, and only afterwards it says Moir HaGodel v'Moir HaKatan. And the Gemara and Chazal asked the question: are they two Gedelim, or one is Godel, one is Katan? Seems to contradict, and that's where we're taught that there was the Miyut HaLevana, the diminishment of the moon, due to its kitrug. The Levana came to God and said, the Gemara Chulin, Daf Samach Amud Beis. So it says like this: the moon came to God and said, you can't have Shnei Ksarim, you can't have one king with two crowns, or one crown for two kings. Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim. So God said, so diminish yourself. Now there'll only be one king. There'll be one great luminary called the sun. Then the Gemara goes on. It's a very strange Gemara on the surface. And that says Hashem then regrets. It says Lech ma'atiyas atzmach. Hashem says, go diminish yourself. Hashem says to the moon, and that's what happens. Then it says God regrets it. And as a result, God says, Hevia like kapara, bring for me an atonement, because shemi'atatiyas hayirech, because I diminished the moon. And that's why in Rosh Chodesh, which is symbolic of the day when the moon is born, it's only possible Rosh Chodesh due to the diminishment of the moon. That's why you bring a special korban chatos. You spend a korban chatos, which is a korban Rosh Chodesh, which is an atonement for God. So of course the whole thing, what does that mean exactly? God wanted to do it, then he had regrets. What's the point in it all? So here's not the place to go into that. It's a big, big discussion in Kabbalah and Chassidus. There's actually a whole sefer from Rabbi Isaac Homler, one of the great Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe and then the Mittler Rebbe, and especially Tzemach Tzedek, called Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim. It's a whole book just called Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim. The whole sefer is just on this. And it's based on, of course, the Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe and the Rabbeim. The Maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek as well about it, and Eratera. But the point that he wants to make here is, so when you just said that the Levana is Mekabel, what do you mean? When was that? Was that after the Miyut or before the Miyut? Because if you're saying it's after the diminishment, then it's not the Etzem Mahusa, Mekabel. It originally there were two Mashpim, sun and moon. And then afterwards, after it was diminished, it became a Mekabel. Says the Rebbe Rashab, no. The Chenu Gam Lifnei HaMiyut. This thing that the Levana or Malchus B'chinas Mekabel is not as a result of the miyut, of the diminishment, which was already a so-called like you could call it, I don't call it a sin, but definitely a downgrade, a setback, so to speak. So even Kishoya B'chinas Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim, even when the sun and moon were two great luminaries before the miyut, Hoya B'chinas Malchus B'chinas Mekabel. Malchus was also a form of Mekabel. In other words, Mekabel is not due to some weakness. It's actually two ways God implanted existence. There should be Mashpia and Mekabel. V'hainu, Gilui hoya b'zah or Malchus. I'm sorry. Gilui hoya b'zah. The Gilui in the beginning of creation was in Zah. That's the sun. Or Malchus kibla al yedei Zah. And even then, even by Shnei Me'eres HaGedelim, according to this interpretation, Malchus was Mekabel from Zah. However, before the Miyut, it was Mekabel in a way that had equal amount of light. It wasn't diminished. So in other words, the moon or Malchus was exactly the same amount of intense light as it was the sun. That's the difference. So it's not that Malchus was not a Mekabel before the Miyut. It was always a Mekabel. But the Kabbalah was such that it created two so-called equal luminaries. One Mashpia, one Mekabel. The Miyut HaLevana caused that the moon should be diminished and it should not have the same level of light as its Mashpia. I mean, hypothetically, it would be similar to a teacher and a student, and the student is receiving from the teacher, but he's receiving it all. And when you listen to the student, he sounds just like the teacher. even though he received it from the teacher. He's not using that example. I'm just using it to drive the point home. And I wrote for myself a note that this was actually mentioned earlier on page 1209. Let me see what it says there. Yeah. Okay, I mentioned the beginning of volume 3. You mentioned that. Okay. Like it says elsewhere, be'inyan keser echad l'shneihem, that there was one keser for both of them. Dahainu shamshach v'malchus rak derech ma'aver hazah. So now he's adding something that it was only derech ma'aver, meaning it did come through zah, but it only passed through. So it wasn't diminished as it passed through. Think of like a funnel. A funnel doesn't diminish the flow; it just directs it. So, well, maybe a funnel is not a good example. Think of like a ma'aver means a passageway. So it's only derech ma'aver, like he said on page 14, like 1209, and therefore that was what it was like before the miyut. But the concept of Mekabel was right from the beginning of creation. When I was listening to how I taught this back originally when we first learned this, so I elaborated there at length about why did God create the world as Mashpia Mekabel? Why didn't he just create everything as a Mashpia? And I explained it because that's the whole purpose of creation. There should be a give and take and a type of cross-pollination, so to speak. Not because the Mekabel is weaker or because the Mekabel has less. That's the way, like Hashem, when Hashem says to David HaMelech, asks Hashem, why did you create the wealthy and the poor? So Hashem's answer is there should be chesed in the world. Chesed dictates there has to be something that one has to give to another. If everybody had equally, would be not giving each other. So in order to create a giving element, you need to have something that needs what you're giving. So Mashpia Mekabel is built into the system. It's not due to the chet etzadas, not due to the miyut halavona. It's not due to any type of weakness or transgression or aberration. It's the way the world was created. Mashpia Mekabel, Zah and Malchus, like he's saying here. Then comes the miyut. Okay, now I would probably skip over the parentheses, not because I want to skip anything, but because we learned it already, and it's easy to find. If you want to learn it all, you can go back there. My goal here is to summarize more and understand it in the larger context of where Hemshech Ayin Beis concludes and where it would conclude and answer questions that were not answered. So I hope you don't mind. I mean, it's very geschmack to learn it again. Don't get me wrong. I'd love to learn it again. But I think I want to discipline myself here. I'm not going to go over everything because then we're going to get very sidetracked on other specific things. And since, again, we learned it already, I don't see a need to do that. Now, if you all vote me down, I'll be happy to defer to all of you. But it's my strong opinion, just simply for what we're trying to achieve here. And again, if anybody wants to learn it, it's all recorded, word for word. I went through every line back a few months ago. Well, it's more than a few months. It's probably over a year ago. How far back did you have to find the piece, yesterday's piece that you posted, Yitzchak? How long? How back?
Almost 2 years. 18 months, 22 months.
Okay, there you go. 2 years. Wow. How man, we've really been on this journey for a long time. So that's what I would prefer to do. Again, simply because we already went through this. Well, I will say is one thing I will quote from inside the parentheses that he says. That this is all without Avodah. Keep in mind, this is how creation took place. Shnei Me'er Sagdelim, Mashpia Mekabel, equal. However, Malchus is receiving its light from Zah. Then comes the miut, and Malchus becomes diminished. But then comes the Aveda of rebuilding Malchus. You must have heard the expression binyan ha-Malchus, like in the 10 days of Tshuva, or other times, binyan ha-Malchus. Or even Tisha B'Av, we talk about the Yerida of Malchus, the Begam ha-Levana sometimes, the wound, or the injured Levana. And then there's the rebuilding of Malchus through our Aveda. In our Aveda, we rebuild Malchus and also the moon to go back to its original stature and even higher, where it becomes equal to the sun again, and in some ways even higher than that. So that's what he does qualify in the presentation, and we will talk about this later because it's going to be very relevant. But as you see, I'm distinguishing between how it is in the beginning of creation and what happens through Aveda. Aveda changes everything. Aveda in general, Tachtenim, Dir b'Tachtenim, which is the lowest of worlds, then you elevate it all to the highest of worlds, meaning higher than all the worlds, save Ma'aseh Machshava Tchila b'Dir b'Tachtenim. But that's through Aveda. Initially, it starts as Tachtenim. So I just wanted to say that point. Yeah. Okay. So the parentheses goes quite a while, maybe 20 lines. And let me see where I'll continue. I want to just go back to a place. Okay, so I'm going to go to the line that begins, V'hainu sha'idei shem Adnai. So bottom line is, we have here Mashpia Mekabel. Initially, they're equal, then the moon is diminished. But there is the concept of Mashpia Mekabel. Aval b'chol zeh, hu shezo hu Mashpia, u Malchus u b'chinas Mekabel. So with all the qualifications that he makes in different sources, bottom line is Zoh is Mashpia, Malchus and Mekabel. V'hefresh b'zeh, I'm reading now 8 lines from the bottom of the page, 1355. What is the difference between Mashpia and Mekabel? The Mashpia b'chinas Gilui, v'Mekabel b'chinas Helem. Remember, he said that earlier as well when he spoke about the sun and the moon on page 1353. And Mashpia is Gilui. That's what Mashpia means. What is he being Mashpia? He's being Mashpia some revelation, some expression. Mekabel on his own is a Helem. That's why he's in a state of Mekabel. He's in a state of, one is speaking, one is listening. One is transmitting, one is absorbing. That's essentially the juxtaposition and the interplay between Mashpia and Mekabel. The Mashpia and Mekabel, how is it? Ohr Keli. It's like an Ohr and a Keli. The Ohr is the revelation of energy or light, and the Keli receives. The Ohr is Gilui be'etzem mahusei. Ohr, what is Ohr? It's Gilui. It's fundamentally its personality. It's very essential. Personality is Gilui. V'akeli be'etzem mahusei b'chinas Helem. And a Keli, fundamentally, its core personality is concealment, a concealed state. Not concealment as in Tzimtzum, but a state of not revelation, of receptivity. If the Keli was like an Ohr, you'd have like two people speaking on it to each other, speaking above. What do you say? Speaking above each other, not above. What do you say? Speaking upon each other.
Across each other.
Yeah, it's like two people speak at the same time. On top of each other. I think is the expression. Whatever. Okay, so Mashpia Mekabel k'may Ohr v'Keli. Good. Where was that? That was definitely in volume 1, probably later as well. Okay. Valkain. And therefore, and that's why when you talk about Ohr, even its lowest level, Hakol b'chinas Ohr v'Gilui. It's all in the form of Ohr v'Gilui. No matter what type of Ohr it is, bottom line, if it's Ohr, that's what Ohr means, Gilui. V'Keli, gamba madrega al and a Keli, even the highest level of a Keli, sheba, he b'chinas Helem u'malemes ala Ohr. It's a concealer and it conceals, or you could say contains and conceals the light. Again, here, concealment, he doesn't necessarily mean in a negative way. He simply means its role is to contain. It's like, think of a cup, a kos. You make kiddush in a cup of wine. The cup's role is not to be mashpia wine. It's to receive the wine, and you should be able to drink from it. And everything else that the cup serves That's its role. You wouldn't have, if you wouldn't have a cup, the wine would be all over, or if the cup was defective. So its role is to be. So even the highest level of Keli, he says, is B'chinas Helem, and even the lowest level of Ohr is, or the other way around, is B'chinas Gilui. Again, I'm going to skip the parentheses. He gives an example from the Neshamas. I'll just sum up what he says. Like a Neshama. Since a Neshama, even the lowest levels of Neshamas is Tzad Elikus Yichel is Baved b'Madrega Yesel Yena. Yeah. Let me just see. I turned the page 1356. Yeah, I'm just going to skip the print. I'm not even going to sum it up. It'll just confuse matters. It'll be a whole discussion of its own. But again, these page, okay. So going back to the next page after the parentheses, Gilui, the same thing we said about Ohr and Keli. Mashpia is a state of Gilui. All the levels of Mashpia are a form of revelation. The fact that a Mashpia can have a tzimtzum where it diminishes the flow in order to be Mashpia, that's not the be'etzem of b'chinas Gilui. That means it's just in addition to his ability to reveal, he also has the ability to put on the brakes, to regulate the flow. But that's a davar shechutz la'atzmei. And that's why l'chein gam b'chol tzimtzum b'chinas Gilui Ohr. That's why no matter how much there's diminishments, the Ohr always remains Ohr. Even if it's just a small spark or a ray of light, it retains its personality of Ohr. We'll soon see why that's relevant. Mekabel, on the other hand, the Mekabel like the Keli, who b'chinas Helem, the etzem husu rak mashul Keli lekabel. Because its fundamental, its core personality is just to be a klei lekabel. That's its role. To have that bittul to be empty and receive. So even though the Ohr, as I said, can diminish itself, but that's like an additional element, a superimposed element, if you wish. Same thing with the Keli, that it's the Ohr, the Gilui that's inside the Keli, that's a davar nesav. The Keli itself, its mission, its role is, etzem husei, is to be Mekabel. And the parentheses just adds that is the point of the bittul of the Keli. It's due to its bittul. That's why it's in that state of Kabbalah. Bittul v'heder ha-metzias. V'lechein, mibchina zah, ima yesh zeh madrega achrena shebe'er ein sof, v'nikra sefer elam ein sof, zah. Even though it's not the highest level, zah is considered to be the lower level of Ohr ein sof, sometimes called sefer elam ein sof, compared to Malchus. Because Zah is drawing from Chabad, which is drawing from Keser, from the higher levels. But since it's a Mashpia, that's why Zah, without Malchus, basically a Ohr without a Keli, you couldn't create existence. So even though Zah is already a flow of Ohr that can manifest in existence, but in itself, even though it is still a state of Ohr Mashpia, to create, you need dafka Malchus. Because Malchus contains that Ohr. And in the sense of being contained, it conceals it to allow for creation to take place. So like, for example, with a teacher and a student, I don't know if he's going to, I think he's going to explain it soon with Mashpia and Mekabel, but let me just give a simple example. With a teacher and a student, it works like this. The teacher is a Mashpia. So it's Gilui. Obviously, he can to somewhat regulate the flow, but he's fundamentally a Mashpia. For him to be able to speak words that are commensurate and tailored to the student, you need to have the student. You need to have the Keli to receive it. As much as the teacher diminishes, it's still not going to be in a form that can create the next level. So it's the Keli that takes it and turns it into as we'll learn, we have learned, as sort of my modest nivra elam, that God says 10 statements, he Ohr, he rakia, that's already the Ohr interacting with the Keli. The Keli is Ohr, rakia, teitz desha. Without that, you would just have energies. And to create, you need to have also Kelim, Oris and Kelim. So Mashpia Mekabel in that context. So as much as Zog goes downward, it still retains, like he said, it's Ohr and Gilui. And you need Malchus to create. Shekenu gam k'moshoyi b'b'chinas shnei me'eres agdela. Me'eres agdelim. He's going back to the, and so too was it the beginning of creation. Mavur b'mokem achar shoyi b'b'chinas hamalchus he'isavas b'b'chinas mitzias davar. That even like he said earlier, that even before there was the diminishment of the moon, the diminishment of Malchus, there was always a need for Mashpia Mekabel in order to create. But then, Elikus. Before the Miut, it was a form of Elikus. But there was a Metzias. Okay, let me see. Like Neshamas of Biyah, they're Elikus, but they are of substance. So even when Malchus was in the state of a Moir HaGodel, that what made it a Mekabel was in a state that it could receive. Like we said, Mekabel is not just after diminishment of the moon of Malchus. It's in the state of Iskabel. And he said, person should always teach their student concise in concise terms. When the Talmud is still young or a beginner, you have to conceal the depths of the seichel. And also a greater student also needs a concise presentation in order to be able to be Mekabel. All this is showing that Mashpia Mekabel is even on a level where there's no diminishment, but you always need to have Mashpia Mekabel to create something. That's what Malchus adds. Zah is Mashpia. Malchus adds that it allows that the Ohr should be received, and that's critical for creation. Because Malchus, no matter how high it is, like he said, is always in a state of Helem, meaning it's not shining with its own light, it's in a state of receiving, which will allow for creation. So basically, period, put it in simple relationship terms. If both husband and wife were Mashpia both at the same time, you're not going to have a relationship. You need to have Mashpia Mekabel. Not because one is greater than the other, but because the only way for it to really become functional is one is transmitting and the other receives. If both are transmitting, you can't have, for example, let's say in the conceiving a child, you need the transmission of the seed in order to fertilize the egg. If it was two seeds trying to fertilize alone, you're not going to have a creation. You're not going to have the birth of a new child. So Mashpia Mekabel is built into the system, regardless now of diminishment, not diminishment, that you need to have Zah and Malchus, period. The only thing is, before the Miut, it would be a form of, it would be a creation that was divine, but it would be a creation. So that's why you need Mashpia Mekabel. Okay, we'll stop here. I'm going to stop for today, but if any questions or comments. This is all going to lead us to come back to understand. It's going to be quite a few pages. I believe that we will get back to the three levels of Ohr Mekabel. Where is it? Probably, yeah, good. Another good 8 pages, page 1364.
It's interesting that the point you make that there needs to be this Mashpia Mekabel in order for creation to occur. So obviously that occurs between a man and a woman in terms of the creation of another human being, but in the macrocosm, in the Seder Histalshalus, that it explains the Helem a little bit, that the darkness we see course, we know that the Eberster had to be mitzamtzem on himself in order to create space for another, for us, for a creation. But that the darkness itself, the Helem, is necessary to our existence, necessary to the creation process. We have to try to fill the world with light once we're created, but it sort of is a little, I don't know what to call it, cold comfort, but it's a reminder, like it's just a necessary part of existence. The darkness is, and it really puts actually a little bit of a positive spin on Helem, which is honestly, besides Tzimtzum in general, we know that I don't know, it's kind of uplifting because darkness and concealment is somewhat depressing to me, anyways. But here it actually frames it in a really, really positive way, frankly. Really interesting.
Okay, well, in volume 2, there's a long, long elaboration on this, where he spoke about Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, day and night is part of creation from the beginning, because you need to have these two elements. I would just rephrase a bit the right terms that he's using. It's really Ohr and Keli, and therefore it's Gilui and Helem, but it's the same idea. In other words, remember, creation by definition means the creation of another entity. As soon as you have another entity, you have to have within you talk about God's creating, you need to have within God, to be logical, you need to create two states. So like Ohr and self-lifnei tzimtzum, the Eitz Chaim says, there's no room for any other consciousness. It only is divine consciousness. The tzimtzum, which is actually called Kelim, as he says in Shar Yechud V'Amun, at the end of chapter 4, is the process where God is concealing in order to allow space for another consciousness, like a teacher allowing space for the student. So creation by definition, if you think about it, simply, it has to consist of two steps at least. One is the Ohr, of course, but then the allowing space for another. So that's really the meaning of a Keli. The real meaning of a Keli is exactly that, creating space for another. That by definition, like he says, is be'etzem ohusei b'chinas Helem. You are concealing yourself, allowing the space for another.
Beautiful. You have a question from someone else in the class. I think his name's Adam, but it just says A. He's asked us already now for about 20 minutes. It's been pending, but he still wants to ask the question. Before the Chet, before the Chet before the sin of the tree of knowledge, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, were Adam and Chava Mashpia Mekabel equally?
Why you could say that why not? You could say Zah and Malchus, and like sun and moon equally, yeah. What do you mean by equally? Whether they the same strength? What means equally?
I don't know. I mean, I think the default you would assume Adam is Mashpia and Chav is Mekabel, and I guess he's saying
but like we're learning here, Mekabel does not mean a weakness. Mekabel is built into the system. Even if there's no chet and there's no miyut halavon or nothing, you need to have two, like I just said, you need a seed and you need an egg. You simply need, for creation purposes, you need these two entities.
Yeah, I'm just reading the question he wrote. I can't.
Okay,
answer.
fine. I'm just saying. So equal, even today they're equal. We don't speak about one superior to. We never speak about one superior. They're both two halves of the divine image in which the human being was created. Bottom line, Mashpia Mekabel has to be understood differently. Many people in this modern world think if one person is Mashpia, that means they're superior to the one that's a Mekabel. It's not the case at all from a Torah point of view. Not at all. They're both absolutely necessary and equal. They play different roles. I mean, it would be like, is the teacher superior to the student? The teacher knows more and is giving to the student, but the student can be even more powerful than the teacher. Sometimes is the trainer more important than the one that's implementing? So I'm just saying that as an overall statement. The problem is in a world, a material world where we misunderstand things, we sometimes think that the one that is, so to speak, Mashpia is superior to the other one, and we abuse it. You see male hierarchies, and we've talked about men and women. It could be abused for sure. But that's another discussion. I don't want to go into that right now. So let's stop here. I finished the paragraph on page 1356. I want to move along at a certain pace. I don't want to get I don't want to use the word bogged down, but I don't want to get too into all the details, really trying to keep that flow going to get it back to our central themes. So we'll do that as we continue this journey.
This fellow, Adam, replied just now. He wants to rejoin on what you said. He said, perhaps before the Chet, they both had the same roles. Maybe that's his point.
But listen, if he wants to come on and speak, I could speak to him, but Mashpia and Mekabel are not the same roles, even before the Chet. Just like Zohar and Malchus don't have the same roles. We don't need two of the same. To have the same role it doesn't achieve anything. We want to have two separate roles. Separate roles is actually what's necessary here. Mashpia role and Mekabel role. And that was the case. Like you just said, even before the Miut, the diminishment of the moon, there was Mashpia and Mekabel. They were the same stature. The light of the moon was just like the light of the sun, as he says, until the diminishment. But the process is a Mashpia and Mekabel one. So it's part of life. It's like a tree sheds seeds, and those seeds will give birth to the next tree. This is the process of all of life, give and take. The cross-pollination of all of existence is dependent on this. Take away Mashpia and Mekabel from creation and nature, we have no existence. It disappears in a second. It's essentially what's called hiskalulus. Think of give and take in the human body. Oxygen, the intake of oxygen. The oxygen oxygenates your blood. Then you exhale, right? The carbon dioxide, you exhale. You inhale again. You eat a piece of food, it goes down. I mean, the interaction, there's give and take. Right now, as we speak, millions, if not billions, even trillions of exchanges going on right now inside your very body. And of course, inside nature. That's Mashpia and Mekabel. That's a built-in process that you need to constantly. And when something is Mashpia, something gives, something else has to close. The windpipe has to be closed when the food goes down the food pipe, etc. And the same thing in every part of our systems. It's constant regulators closing and opening and channeling and filtering. This is all a process of a give and take on the simplest level. And the same is on a psychological level. The mind, the emotions, our interaction with each other. There's a give and take. I give, you take, then I take from you. To take and receive, essentially, is what he's saying here. And that is built into the system from the beginning. That's the way God created the world. That's nothing to do with any chet or any diminishment and so on. Okay.
He said thank you, by the way.
Sure. Okay, so we stop here, stop the recording, page 1356. You're welcome, I should say.